Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another plunge into the depths of history?
Always.
Today, we're tackling a topic that's both fascinating and controversial. Pre-Columbian contact.
Yeah, we're going beyond those Viking voyages everyone's heard of.
Exactly. Think Polynesian sailors, maybe even African explorers reaching the Americas long before Columbus.
Mind-blowing stuff, right? Challenging those old history textbooks.
Totally. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, where do these theories even come from? Like, how far back do they go?
Well, you might be surprised to hear this, but speculation about pre-Columbian contact goes all the way back to the 16th century.
Well, really. So practically as soon as Europeans set foot in the Americas, they were already wondering if someone beat them to it.
Pretty much. Some of the earliest theories popped up in writings by those Spanish chroniclers. The ones documenting those first encounters.
Makes sense. They're seeing these complex societies, these advanced cultures, and they're thinking, hold on, how did this all happen?
Exactly. They were especially intrigued by stories of those lost cities, and advanced civilizations. Really fueled their imaginations.
So what were their theories like? Were they based on solid evidence or more like wild guesses and cool stories?
Well, let's just say the evidence back then was a bit more anecdotal.
So more like campfire stories than hard fact.
Kinda, yeah. Lots of myths and legends woven in. You gotta remember, back then, global geography was still a bit fuzzy.
Right, maps were being filled in, the Earth being round was a relatively new concept.
Exactly. But hey, those early theories, they offer a glimpse into how Europeans were grappling with this whole new world situation.
Trying to fit it into their worldview.
Exactly. But then we hit the 19th century and things start to shift.
How so?
Well, that's when we see this push for more scientific explanations for contact.
The age of reason.
Right. But of course, even the science of that era was colored by, well, the biases of the time.
Makes sense. Every era has its blind spots.
For sure. So, for example, people notice similarities between Polynesian and American cultures.
Oh, interesting. Like, what kind of similarities?
Shared sailing traditions, even the presence of ships with triangular sails in the Andes.
Wait, triangular sails in the Andes? That's a
Oh,
long way from the Pacific.
I know, right? It's fascinating. And those kinds of things got people thinking there must have been some kind of connection across the Pacific.
It's like finding puzzle pieces that seem to fit but are from totally different boxes.
Exactly. And to make it even wilder, there's this map by Bory de Saint-Vincent grouping the Pacific coasts of the Americas with Polynesia, even parts of Africa, based on racial classifications.
Wow, so he's literally drawing lines across the globe, connecting cultures based on, well, the limited understanding of race back then.
It's a real snapshot of how science and social beliefs were intertwined, something to always keep in mind when we're looking back at these theories.
Right, science is never completely objective, is it?
Nope. And don't forget the religious side of things. In the 19th century, you've got all these religious missions popping up around the world.
So missionaries are out there converting people, but also observing cultures and looking for connections.
Exactly. They were some of the first to really interact with indigenous populations, and their writings played a big role in shaping these theories.
Makes sense, they're on the front lines, so to speak.
And they were particularly interested in language, material culture, even physical anthropology, looking for clues to support their ideas about cultural origins.
So we've got Spanish chroniclers,
Hmm.
scientists with their new theories, and religious missionaries all adding fuel to the fire.
Right. And then, to make it even more interesting, there's the theory of a sunken Pacific continent.
Wait, did you just say a sunken continent, like a
Huh?
real-life Atlantis?
Yeah. In the 19th century, it was actually considered a plausible geological theory.
Whoa, that's crazy. So how did that tie into pre-Columbian contact?
Well, it was seen as this potential explanation for how cultures on opposite sides of the Pacific could share certain traits, like maybe there was this land bridge, this lost continent that connected them all.
Okay, I see. So it's like filling in the missing pieces of the map with a giant, mysterious continent.
Exactly. And it fit nicely with all those old stories about ancient lands and civilizations disappearing beneath the waves.
It's a pretty captivating idea. So what happened to this theory?
Well, as our scientific understanding of things like plate tectonics got better, the idea of a sunken continent became less believable.
It couldn't hold up against the hard science.
Exactly. And that brings us to the 20th century, where things take another wild turn.
Okay, I'm hooked. What happens next?
Well, the early 20th century sees this surge in the popularity of trans-Pacific contact theories, and a lot of that was fueled by, well, a guy named Thor Heyerdahl.
Oh, Thor Heyerdahl, the Kon-Tiki expedition.
You got it. That expedition really captured the public's imagination.
It's such an amazing story. He built a raft, sailed across the Pacific, all to prove that Polynesia could have been settled from the Americas.
And his voyages sparked a whole wave of experimental archaeology people trying to recreate those ancient seafaring journeys.
So even if his theories weren't fully embraced by academics, he opened up a whole new way of thinking about the past.
Definitely. And as science advanced, we started seeing even more rigorous approaches to studying pre-Columbian contact.
So less adventurous voyages and more lab work.
Kind of. New techniques emerged, genetic analysis, linguistic comparisons, even more advanced archaeology.
So we're talking about analyzing ancient DNA, comparing languages, digging deeper into those archaeological sites.
Exactly. And these new methods started to refine the debate. We even saw challenges to some long-held assumptions, like, for example, there's still this debate about the sweet potato.
The sweet potato, what's the mystery there?
Well, it's all about how it got to Oceania. Some say Polynesians brought it over way before Columbus. Others think it was introduced later by the Spanish.
So a botanical mystery with global implications.
Exactly. And then there's the physical evidence, things like those chicken-like bird vessels found in Peru, dating back to pre-Columbian times.
Wait, chicken-like birds in Peru before Columbus? How is that even possible?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It hints at potential contact, but the evidence is, well, it's still inconclusive.
So like the sweet potato, it's a piece of the puzzle, but we're not sure exactly where it fits.
That's the thing with this topic. There's all these tantalizing clues, these bits of evidence that seem to point towards pre-Columbian contact. But it's like we're still missing some crucial connections.
So where does that leave us? Are we any closer to answering the big question?
Yeah.
Was there pre-Columbian contact?
I think the most important thing we've learned from all these theories is that the ancient world was a lot more interconnected than we once believed.
It challenges that old idea of isolated continents and cultures.
For sure. Humans have always been explorers, always driven to connect with others and to push the boundaries of what's known.
And while we might not have definitive proof of widespread pre-Columbian contact, the possibility is definitely there, and the search for answers continues.
It does. And that's what makes this whole topic so exciting, right? It's like this historical detective story, and we're hot on the trail of clues.
Exactly. And who knows what mind-blowing discoveries might be waiting just around the corner.
Speaking of new discoveries, earlier you mentioned Vikings, Polynesians, and even Africans possibly reaching the Americas before Columbus. Now, the Vikings, they're a bit different, right? We know they were here. Yeah, they are. I mean, their presence in North America, that's pretty well documented. But when it comes to potential African contact, now that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. But the Atlantic Ocean, that's a pretty massive body of water. How are we even supposed to consider that ancient Africans might have crossed it?
I know, right? It seems pretty daunting. But hey, remember those Spanish chroniclers we talked about earlier? Well, some of their writings actually describe meeting people of African descent already living in the Americas.
Whoa, seriously. So we're not just talking about hypothetical voyages here. There were actual accounts of Africans in the Americas before Columbus.
Yeah, and it's not just some obscure chronicler. We're talking about Columbus himself. He wrote about hearing from indigenous folks in the Caribbean about black traders who had visited from a land to the south.
No way. Columbus himself mentioned this. The guy who supposedly discovered America, talking about Africans already being there. It's like he's accidentally disproving his own story.
It's wild, isn't it? It suggests that the presence of Africans in the Americas was already known, at least among some indigenous groups, way before Columbus showed up.
Okay, so we've got Columbus's account. What else is there?
Well, there's this other intriguing report about those early Spanish conquistadors in Mexico. They supposedly encountered some indigenous people using this gold-tipped metal object, and it looked a lot like a guinea.
A guinea, like from the region of Guinea in West Africa. That's a
Yeah.
pretty specific connection.
Right. And that little detail has fueled all sorts of speculation about possible trade routes, maybe even voyages back and forth between Africa and the Americas.
So we're not just imagining some random Africans washing ashore by chance. We're talking about potential intentional voyages, maybe even established trade networks.
Some researchers think so, yeah. Of course, we always got to consider the context of these historical accounts, any potential biases the writers might have had. But when you put all these pieces together, They paint this picture of an Atlantic world that was maybe a lot more interconnected than we traditionally thought.
It's like we're uncovering all these hidden connections, these threads that link different parts of the world together.
Exactly. And it gets even more intriguing when you start looking at potential cultural similarities between certain West African and ancient American
Oh,
societies.
wow. Cultural similarities. What kind of
Yeah.
things are we talking about here?
Well, there are some interesting parallels in religious practices, art styles, even some agricultural techniques. Some argue that these similarities are just too specific to have developed independently. It suggests some kind of cultural exchange, some diffusion of ideas.
So things like shared symbols, rituals, maybe even crops that traveled across the Atlantic.
Right. For example, there are these similarities in how masks and sculptures were used in religious ceremonies, and there are parallels in some burial practices, even in certain cosmological beliefs.
It's almost like finding pieces of the same puzzle, but in two totally different parts of the world. You can't help but wonder how they ended up there.
Exactly. And these cultural connections, together with those historical accounts, they've led some scholars to propose that there must have been some contact, even if it was just sporadic or infrequent.
Okay, this is all super fascinating, but I have to ask, if there was all this contact between Africa and the Americas before Columbus, why haven't we found more concrete evidence? I mean, we've got Viking settlements in North America, tons of research on potential Polynesian contact. Where's the proof of ancient African settlements or artifacts in the Americas?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that's stumped researchers for a long time. I mean, first off, the Americas are huge. We've only explored a tiny fraction of all the potential archaeological sites out there. It's totally possible that evidence of African contact is out there, buried somewhere, just waiting to be found.
So it's like finding a needle in a haystack, but on a continental scale?
Pretty much. Plus, we got to think about the nature of the contact. If it was mostly small-scale trade or maybe just exploration, they might not have left behind those big settlements or massive structures we associate with other ancient civilizations.
So maybe instead of looking for grand pyramids or lost cities, we should be focusing on smaller, more subtle clues, like traces of African DNA in ancient American populations, or maybe specific types of pottery or
Oh,
tools.
you got it. And there have been some really interesting hints in those areas. Some genetic studies suggest the presence of African DNA in certain indigenous groups down in South America. But interpreting those findings is really complex. There's a lot of debate still. It's like this giant puzzle, and we're just starting to figure out where all the pieces fit.
Every time we uncover a new piece, it seems like it leads to even more questions.
That's the beauty of history, right?
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, ancient Africans did make it to the Americas. What kind of technology would they have needed? We're talking about crossing an entire ocean here.
Right. It's a massive undertaking. We tend to think that ancient folks just weren't capable of those long ocean voyages. But what if we're underestimating them? What if their shipbuilding and navigation skills were way more advanced than we give them credit for?
Okay, now you're getting me thinking. Are there any clues that support that idea?
Well, think about this. There's evidence that ancient Egyptians were building sophisticated seafaring vessels as far back as 3000 BCE. And we know there was tons of trade happening along the African coast, maybe even reaching as far as the Indian Ocean.
So they were definitely no strangers to the sea, but those are coastal voyages. Crossing the Atlantic is a whole different ballgame.
True, but remember, we're talking about the civilization that built the pyramids. They had advanced math, astronomy, a deep understanding of agriculture, medicine. Is it really so crazy to think they might have mastered long-distance navigation too?
I guess you're right. When you put it that way, it doesn't seem so impossible. But how would they have navigated without all the modern instruments we have today?
Well, while we don't have all the answers, there are hints that ancient seafarers were incredibly resourceful and observant. They probably used a combo of things: celestial navigation, watching wind patterns and ocean currents. They might have even used the behavior of birds and marine life to help guide their way.
So they were like the ultimate naturalists, using their knowledge of the environment to navigate across vast distances. That's incredible.
It is. And it wasn't just the Egyptians. There's evidence suggesting other African cultures were also skilled navigators. Take the Malian Empire, for example. They flourished in West Africa from the 13th to 16th centuries. They had this whole rich tradition of seafaring.
Really? I didn't know that.
There are accounts of Malian fleets sailing along the African coast, and some think they might have ventured even further. So we're talking about this whole network of potential seafaring cultures in Africa, and we're only just starting to rediscover their stories.
It's amazing to think about all these hidden chapters in history
Hmm.
just waiting to be uncovered.
And remember, history's full of surprises. What we think is impossible often turns out to be totally plausible once we dig a little deeper.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, that ancient Africans did have the skills and knowledge to reach the Americas.
Hmm?
What would have motivated them to make such a dangerous journey?
Well, now we're getting into speculation territory, but there are a few possibilities. One, of course, is trade. Africa had all sorts of resources that would have been valuable in the Americas: gold, ivory, certain textiles, and ancient trade routes were vast. It's not out of the realm of possibility that some adventurous African traders might have been lured across the Atlantic looking for new markets.
Like following the ancient equivalent of the Silk Road, but across the ocean.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about material goods. Ideas and knowledge were also valuable back then. So maybe African explorers and scholars were drawn to the Americas in search of new knowledge or to share their own cultural and scientific discoveries.
It's fascinating to think about those ancient exchanges of knowledge and culture happening across these vast distances.
And it really throws a wrench in that old idea that civilizations were isolated from each other.
Right. There's another possibility, too. Maybe exploration for its own sake was the driving force. That innate human desire to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries of what's possible.
Like those Polynesian voyagers who explored vast stretches of the Pacific, driven by a thirst for discovery and adventure. It's not crazy to think some ancient Africans might have felt that same pull.
So we've got trade, intellectual exchange, and good old-fashioned exploration as potential motivations. But let's get back to the evidence, or maybe the lack of it. Why do you think we haven't found more concrete archaeological proof of African contact, especially compared to those trans-Pacific theories?
Well, remember, we talked about the Americas being huge. That's definitely part of it. There's just so much ground to cover, so many potential archaeological sites yet to be explored. It's entirely possible that evidence of African contact is out there, hidden somewhere. We just haven't stumbled across it yet.
So it's not necessarily that the evidence doesn't exist, it's more like we haven't found it yet.
Exactly. Plus, if the contact was mostly small scale, they might not have left behind the same kind of obvious traces as, say, the Vikings.
So we need to adjust our expectations. Maybe look for those smaller, more subtle clues.
Right. And while there have been some intriguing leads, like those genetic studies, the interpretation of that kind of evidence is still ongoing.
It's like a giant puzzle, and we're slowly but surely finding the pieces.
Exactly. And as we continue to explore, who knows what amazing discoveries are waiting for us?
Well, on that note, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another group of pre-Columbian explorers, the Vikings. Their presence in North America is pretty well documented, but how does their story fit into this broader narrative of pre-Columbian contact? Yeah, we've got Vikings sailing to North America. It's pretty well established, right?
Yeah.
But how does their story compare to those more, well, speculative theories about Polynesian or African contact?
The Viking presence in North America is super interesting because it's like this confirmed case of pre-Columbian contact. We've got actual archaeological evidence, like the Alonso Meadows settlement up in Newfoundland. It dates back to around the 1000 CE. It really shows you just how skilled those Viking seafarers were.
Right. Those Viking longships braving the icy Atlantic. It's the stuff of legends. But it doesn't seem like they had the same kind of widespread impact on the Americas as some people think the Polynesians or Africans might have.
That's right. While the Vikings did reach North America, their influence seems to have been pretty localized. They didn't establish these big settlements or create extensive trade networks across the continent.
Why not? I mean, if they could cross the Atlantic, what stopped them from exploring further south?
There are a few theories about that. One possibility is the climate. Vikings were used to those harsh, cold conditions up in Scandinavia, so those warmer climates further south, they might have found them less hospitable. Or maybe they ran into environments and diseases they just weren't prepared for.
So even though they were expert seafarers, the environment itself might have been a big obstacle.
Exactly. And then there's the fact that North America was already home to well-established indigenous populations. The Vikings, they weren't just explorers, right? They were also warriors, and in some cases, colonizers. They may have faced resistance from those indigenous groups, which would have made further exploration or settlement a lot less appealing.
So maybe a combination of environmental challenges and potential conflict with the locals kind of kept them from expanding further south.
That's a very plausible scenario. But we're still learning about the Viking presence in North America. New discoveries could always change our understanding.
Like you said before, history is always evolving, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of evolving perspectives, it's important to think about how these pre-Columbian contact theories change our understanding of indigenous cultures. For a long time, the dominant narrative was that these societies were isolated, unchanging, until Europeans showed up. But these contact theories challenge that whole idea. They suggest that indigenous cultures were dynamic, interconnected, long before Columbus arrived.
It's like we're finally starting to see indigenous history on its own terms, not just as a lead-up to colonization.
Exactly. These theories force us to acknowledge that indigenous peoples were active participants in shaping the history of the Americas. They had their own complex networks of trade, migration, cultural exchange, and these networks might have extended way beyond what we previously imagined.
It's a really important shift in perspective, recognizing the agency and complexity of indigenous cultures. So after this deep dive into pre-Columbian contact, what are some of the key things we should be taking away from all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the past is way more complex and interconnected than we often give it credit for. That traditional narrative of history, with its emphasis on separation and isolation, it just doesn't capture the full picture. We need to be open to the possibility that ancient civilizations were capable of amazing things. Feats of exploration, innovation, cultural exchange that we might not even fully grasp yet.
It's like we're putting together this giant puzzle, and each new discovery, each new theory, helps us see a clearer picture of just how interconnected the ancient world really was.
That's a great way to put it. And the quest for answers goes on. Archaeologists, historians, geneticists, linguists, they're all working together to uncover the mysteries of the past. Who knows what mind-blowing discoveries might be just around the corner?
Maybe someday we'll find that definitive proofs that settles all the debates. But even if we don't, this whole process of exploring and discovering is pretty amazing in itself.
Couldn't agree more. It's a journey that forces us to rethink our assumptions, question what we think we know, and appreciate the ingenuity and resilience of our ancestors.
This has been an awesome deep dive. It's mind-blowing to think about those potential ancient connections stretching across vast oceans. It makes you wonder, what other secrets are hidden in the depths of history, just waiting for us to find them?
That's the beauty of history, isn't it? There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to uncover.
Well, that wraps up this deep dive, but we hope you'll keep exploring these topics on your own. There's a ton of great books, articles, documentaries out there. Go check them out.
And let us know what you think. What really stood out to you in this deep dive? Any burning questions you still have? Hit us up in the comments below.
And hey, if you enjoyed this journey into the mysteries of pre-Columbian contact, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the fascinating world of history. Thanks for joining us.